Amazon Music. Early one morning, a concerned mother sat beside her young son inside of a hospital room. He was lying in the bed, curled into a ball, and he was drenched with sweat, and he was clutching his stomach. His doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him, and until they did, they couldn't cure him. For now, all they could do was keep the boy hydrated and hope for a breakthrough. But, judging from how miserable her son looked, it didn't seem like the doctors were helping at all. The mother was starting to get worried that her little boy's life was in danger. The mother stood up to call the nurse when all of a sudden she felt dizzy and lightheaded. She sat back down and realized she was starting to sweat. A lot. This was exactly how her son's illness had started. Whatever he had, now she had it too. What she didn't know, though, was that thousands of other people were experiencing the same terrifying symptoms too. This was just the beginning of an outbreak that would spread across the entire United States. And there was no cure in sight. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please offer to detail the follow button's car, but be sure to hide a slightly open can of tuna under their front seat. This episode is called Common Ground. On August 8th, 1998, Sharon Anderson's eyes shot open to the sound of her 8-year-old son's wailing. She glanced over at the bedside clock and saw it was only 4 a.m. Toby, her son, was a very deep sleeper, so she knew it had to be something serious to wake him up at this hour. So Sharon jumped out of bed and rushed down the hall to his room. Toby was still in his bed, and he was holding his belly with both hands. He was covered by a film of sweat, and he was moaning in pain. Sharon laid the back of her hand on Toby's forehead, and she found that he was burning hot. In fact, he felt much hotter than when he normally got sick. Sharon knew her son needed medical attention right now. She rushed back to her bedroom, woke up her husband, and told him to go get the car ready so they could drive their son to the emergency room. Then she ran back to Toby's room, she scooped him up in a blanket, and carried him down the hall. It was still dark out as Sharon and her husband loaded Toby into their car. Fortunately, the streets of Minneapolis were empty at that hour as they raced to the nearest hospital. Attending physician Dr. Jean Miller was just starting her shift when her office intercom buzzed and a voice announced that an 8-year-old boy named Toby had just been wheeled into the ER. His mother, Sharon, said Toby had been feverish for hours and was throwing up. Dr. Miller jumped up from her desk and dashed down the hall to the emergency room. She found Toby lying in bed, his eyes half open and his skin drained of color, while his pajamas were dark with sweat. The boy's parents hovered beside the bed looking worried and helpless. Dr. Miller called for a nurse to bring an IV saline drip to get some fluids into the boy. Then she measured his heartbeat and listened to his breathing. But the child's intense stomach pains suggested that whatever was going on was an intestinal issue. That covered a lot of possibilities, from food poisoning to something much more serious like appendicitis. Dr. Miller asked Toby's parents if he'd eaten anything unusual lately. They looked at each other and listed various meals from the past few days, but then said that nothing out of the ordinary came to mind. Dr. Miller nodded, then asked Toby where it hurt most. With very shaky hands, Toby pointed to his stomach. Tears formed in his eyes, and he told Dr. Miller the pain was getting even worse. Dr. Miller smiled calmly, doing her best to hide her concern that Toby seemed to be sinking. The doctor grabbed a phone off the wall and called the lab to order blood and stool samples. That would likely identify what was happening inside of Toby's body. The doctor was pretty sure it was some kind of food poisoning, but the boy's intense discomfort suggested that it could be more serious than your run-of-the-mill 24-hour stomach bug. Dr. Miller took the parents aside and told them to make a list of every food and every place that Toby had eaten in the past 4 days. Dr. Miller promised they would find out what was happening to their son and they would do everything in their power to make him right again. A few hours later, Dr. Miller's phone rang. It was the lab with Toby's results. They found blood in Toby's stool, which indicated intestinal bleeding, most likely from bacteria in his food. So Dr. Miller had apparently been right. It was some kind of food poisoning. Now they needed to figure out what kind of food poisoning it was. The lab technician said they had already isolated the bacteria from Toby's stool for closer analysis. Dr. Miller thanked the technician and hung up. The good news was that they were now closer to knowing what was making Toby sick. But the bad news was, until then, Dr. Miller could not really aggressively treat Toby's illness. For many bacterial infections, the best treatment is antibiotics, but with certain strains of bacteria, such as highly toxic strains of E. coli, antibiotics can actually make the patient sicker or even kill them. So for now, all Dr. Miller could do was keep Toby's fever down with medication and his dehydration at bay with an IV drip. Dr. Miller checked in with Toby's parents and told them to get some rest and that she would be back at the hospital first thing in the morning. Then the doctor left the room and went to the night nurse and told her to please contact her at home if anything changed with Toby. The next morning, Dr. Miller had just sat down behind her desk with a mug of coffee when a nurse knocked on the door and poked her head in. She said there was a new arrival to the ER, a 4-year-old girl named Peyton Egger. She had a sweltering 104-degree fever, and her mother said she'd been vomiting on and off for 12 hours with repeated bouts of diarrhea. Dr. Miller's mind raced as she followed the nurse down to the emergency department. White curtains were drawn all around a gurney that had just been wheeled in. Little Peyton was lying on the gurney, drenched in sweat. Her face was drained of color, and she was struggling to keep her eyes open, and her parents stood to the side, clutching each other nervously. Dr. Miller immediately ordered the nurses to hook Peyton up to an IV drip while she checked the girl's vitals. Peyton's pulse was weak, and her blood pressure was dropping. Dr. Miller worried she might be going into shock, which could cause her organs to shut down. Dr. Miller realized that Peyton's symptoms were very similar to Toby's, so much so that she wondered if both kids had caught the same infection. Peyton's parents told Dr. Miller that their home was in a suburb north of Minneapolis, which was nowhere near where Toby's family lived. Still, Dr. Miller thought there must be something these two kids had in common. Dr. Miller called the lab and told them she wanted full blood work run on Peyton, plus stool samples tested as well. Then, Dr. Miller took Peyton's parents into the hallway and asked them for more details. The mother said that Peyton had been complaining of stomach pains last night, but it really hadn't seemed that serious. But at around midnight, Peyton woke up crying from all the pain and then began vomiting. After that, she kept vomiting nearly every hour and had several episodes of severe diarrhea. Then her temperature started spiking. By dawn, the parents said it was clear that whatever this was, it was only getting worse. So her parents had rushed her to the hospital. Dr. Miller said they had done the right thing. Peyton would be safe here. For now, the best thing they could do was just stay calm and wait. But that was advice Dr. Miller found easier to give than to practice. As Dr. Miller stepped out of Peyton's room and headed back to her office, a nurse hurried up to her and said the lab had been trying to reach her. Toby's new results were in. The boy was infected with a bacteria called Shigella. Finally, Dr. Miller knew what she was up against. Shigella attacks the digestive system, causing inflammation and bleeding within 12 to 48 hours after eating food contaminated with the bacteria. Toby had all of the classic symptoms: fever, abdominal pain, nausea, diarrhea. Dr. Miller knew that if untreated, Shigella could send Toby into shock, which often leads to organ failure and occasionally even death. But at the same time, Dr. Miller was relieved. Although Shigella was obviously serious, it could be defeated with antibiotics, so she could finally start treating Toby. Dr. Miller told the attending nurse to prepare antibiotics for Toby and begin administering them as soon as they were ready. Then Dr. Miller rushed to Toby's room to give his parents the news. The boy was lying in his hospital bed with his eyes half open. His mother sat in a chair next to the bed, holding her son's hand and looking flushed and exhausted. Dr. Miller asked Toby's parents to step outside with her so she could explain what was going on. But when Toby's mother tried to stand up, she wobbled and had to sit back down. She admitted she had not been feeling well since she woke up that morning. She said she even vomited a couple of times. Dr. Miller told Toby's mother to stay seated while she called for a nurse to prepare a bed for her. The doctor told her it was entirely possible that she was also now infected with Shigella, which was the bacteria that they had just discovered her son was infected with. After all, Shigella is so contagious that it can be passed in a handshake if someone who touched the bacteria didn't wash their hands well enough. As soon as Dr. Miller had settled Toby's mother into her own hospital bed, a receptionist waved the doctor down. It was the lab calling again. They had the results for Dr. Miller's other young patient, Peyton. She had Shigella too. Dr. Miller put down the phone. First Toby, then maybe Toby's mother, and now Peyton? Suddenly, Dr. Miller felt like she had an outbreak on her hands. And given how easily Shigella is transmitted, there were likely dozens more people out there suffering symptoms at home, and every one of those cases could make more people sick. Suddenly, Dr. Miller had a lot of calls to make. Later on that same afternoon in August of 1998, a young epidemiologist at the Minnesota Department of Health named Dr. Julie Wickland was sitting at her desk when her secretary buzzed. She told her there was an urgent call coming in from a local hospital. Dr. Wickland was only in her 20s and still trying to prove herself professionally, but one thing she had already learned was that being an epidemiologist meant everything was a potential emergency. People's lives were always on the line. She picked up the phone and called Dr. Miller, who described the potential Shigella outbreak she was facing, 3 cases in her hospital, and likely a lot more people at home right now who just weren't sick enough to head to the hospital yet. But soon they would be. Once Dr. Wickland was done hearing from Dr. Miller, she requested to have Toby and Peyton's families fill out food history charts with everything they had eaten in the past 4 days. Then she met with her team at the Department of Health and assigned some of her best investigators to join her on this case. By the time she got back to her office, Dr. Wickland's secretary came in holding a stack of papers. The families had already filled out and faxed over their kids' food histories. Dr. Wickland spread them out on her desk and scanned them to look for commonalities. Right away, she noticed a pattern. They had all eaten at a restaurant called Roberta's. The odds were extremely low that both Toby and Peyton's families had eaten at the same place in the same 4-day window, especially considering how far apart they lived, and so this was exactly the type of breakthrough Dr. Wickland was hoping for. An hour later, Dr. Wickland and 2 other health officials stepped out of a dark sedan in front of the restaurant Roberta's, a modest neighborhood eatery. The manager was waiting for them by the entrance, looking very tense. The restaurant was temporarily closed for the rest of the day so that Dr. Wickland and her team could go and conduct their investigation there. Dr. Wickland needed to inspect every aspect of the restaurant's food handling for possible sources of contamination, such as spoiled food or dirty water. Dr. Wickland assigned one investigator to record the temperatures inside the refrigerators and freezers, while another investigator took water samples from all the sinks and taps. Then Dr. Wickland studied every step in the food's journey to the table, from the delivery area to the storage room to the food prep stations. The overall layout at Roberta's met safety standards, but Dr. Wickland knew how elusive Shigella could be. Shigella can show up almost anywhere and then can be spread by the people who are simply preparing the food. Dr. Wickland told the manager she needed to interview the entire staff. And so once the staff was gathered in the dining room, Dr. Wickland circled the room, asking each employee questions about their recent health and also their daily kitchen routine. Several members of the staff admitted to Dr. Wickland that they had not been feeling very good lately. Some had even been feverish and suffering pretty severe abdominal pains. It sounded worryingly similar to what Toby and Toby's mother and Peyton were all experiencing. Dr. Wickland then made copies of the restaurant's reservation list and credit card receipts from the past 4 days. Flipping through the pages, she estimated at least 400 people had eaten at Roberta's within a few days of when Dr. Miller's patients had eaten there. All of these diners were now at risk of getting Shigella. Back at the office, Dr. Wickland wrote up a questionnaire for all of Roberta's 400-plus diners. She needed to determine how many other customers out there were suffering similar symptoms. If any of them had contracted Shigella but didn't realize it, they could be infecting other people. These people needed to be notified right away, or else this situation could get much worse. The next morning, when Dr. Wickland arrived at her office, she learned that one of Roberta's employees had tested positive for Shigella. This confirmed that everyone who had eaten at the restaurant could now potentially be infected with the Shigella bacteria. But at least she now had a pretty good idea where the Shigella was coming from, a sick food prep worker who likely had not washed their hands properly. Dr. Wickland's first step was to call Roberta's and order the restaurant temporarily closed until the Shigella outbreak was totally contained. Then Dr. Wickland called Dr. Miller to get an update on her patients. Dr. Miller told her that Toby's mom was doing fine, but Toby and Peyton were struggling. Shigella is always harshest on the young and the elderly, and the children's conditions were not getting better. If they didn't start getting better soon, Dr. Miller feared they could go into shock and die. Early the next day, Dr. Wickland's phone rang with new results from the lab. Several more employees at Roberta's restaurant had tested positive for Shigella. This meant that the disease outbreak was not coming from a single unsanitary worker. It was coming from lots of places. Dr. Wickland got a fresh cup of coffee and then sat down at her desk to begin studying the first wave of questionnaire results from Roberta's recent customers. And she was disturbed to see that a full half of the 400 diners reported experiencing symptoms that were consistent with Shigella. But as Dr. Wickland studied the responses, something about the data just didn't seem right. A large percentage of infected diners had eaten at Roberta's before any of the employees started to get sick. So it was unlikely that the employees were giving the infection to the customers. The workers were actually victims too. Dr. Wickland leaned back in her chair and took a deep, defeated breath. She now realized that she actually had no idea where all the Shigella cases were coming from. An hour later, the manager at Roberta's unlocked the restaurant door and let in Dr. Wickland. She told the team to put on gloves and start discarding every piece of food in the building. Nothing could be saved. Roberta's manager was happy to comply, and Dr. Wickland told him the business could reopen once all the food had been thrown away and the entire restaurant professionally cleaned. They couldn't afford to take any chances. Dr. Wickland pulled a bin of produce off a shelf and dumped it in the trash. The Shigella was somewhere under this roof, and Dr. Wickland was not going to let it slip past her. Dr. Wickland returned to her office at the Department of Health to find a report sitting on her desk. Her heart sank. It was the details of another case of Shigella, this time north of Minneapolis. A 33-year-old woman had been rushed to a hospital after hours of vomiting, fever, and diarrhea. The night before, the woman had eaten at an upscale restaurant in her neighborhood called Marty's. Not only that, but she'd gone to the restaurant with multiple friends, all of whom had been contacted and reported feeling sick. But Marty's restaurant was very far from Roberta's. For this illness to strike two restaurants in entirely different areas, miles apart from one another, was extremely rare. Dr. Wickland sighed and called the manager at Marty's to tell them the restaurant would have to close until further notice. She said that a health official would be there shortly to collect their reservation list and credit card receipts, and all their recent diners would need to be contacted about the disease outbreak. Dr. Wickland then called a meeting with her investigators to brainstorm. She felt lucky that there had been no fatalities so far, but she also knew that young children were in the greatest danger. She told her team they had to find the link between Marty's restaurant and Roberta's restaurant that could explain all the Shigella cases. Maybe both restaurants sourced particular food items from the same place, or maybe an employee worked part-time at both restaurants, or maybe they shared a water supplier. Whatever it was, she told her team they had to go find out. By the next afternoon, Dr. Wickland had more information to go on. She and her team had worked around the clock, contacting people and compiling timelines of symptoms. It was a lot to sift through, but she knew it was always better to have too much information rather than not enough. As Dr. Wickland made her way through all the paper piled on her desk, the differences between the two restaurants really jumped out at her. Marty's got its water from a different reservoir than Roberta's, so this was not a water issue. There was also almost zero overlap in their menus because Roberta's and Marty's served very different types of food. And a review of the two restaurants' employees showed that no staff members worked in both places either. The researchers could not even identify a single food that all the sick customers at each restaurant had eaten. Everyone ordered different dishes, yet got sick the same way. And so Dr. Wickland wondered to herself, how could that be? This just doesn't seem possible. Just then, the phone rang. It was the lab with an update on the Marty's restaurant customers. Everyone who tested had come back positive for Shigella. The lab had also done a genetic comparison of the Shigella bacteria from the Marty's diners and the Roberta's diners, and they found them to be identical. Clearly, both restaurants had been contaminated by the same source. Dr. Wickland thanked the technician and hung up. She felt stumped, exhausted, and ready to call it quits for the day, but she did have a couple more calls to make. The first one just to check up on Toby and Peyton. On the other end of the line, Dr. Miller sounded equally exhausted. She said Toby was still bedridden because his body was not responding to the antibiotics. He was now faced with a painful and slow recovery. Little Peyton Egger was even worse. Dr. Miller had nurses monitoring her around the clock, but her family was obviously worried sick. Dr. Wickland thanked her for the update, then she hung up and scrolled through her Rolodex until she found the United States Centers for Disease Control. This outbreak was clearly not settling down the way Dr. Wickland hoped it would, and so it was time to call in reinforcements. Dr. Timothy Niemi was in his office packing up to head home when his phone rang. He considered letting it go to voicemail, but his position as an epidemic intelligence officer at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had taught him the danger of missing an emergency call. So he picked up the phone and he listened carefully as Dr. Wickland explained the events of the past week and how the Shigella outbreak showed no signs of slowing down. Dr. Wickland said she needed the CDC's help in finding the outbreak's origin so they could stop it. Every bacterial outbreak has its own genetic fingerprint that makes it unique, and the CDC keeps a massive database of these fingerprints from all over the world. Dr. Niemi told Dr. Wickland to email him an image of the Shigella bacteria's DNA profile. Then he could use the CDC's database to see if the same Shigella strain had been reported anywhere else. The moment Dr. Niemi uploaded the Shigella bacteria from Minnesota to his database, Shigella outbreaks in other areas popped up all over. From Los Angeles County to Boston to Florida, plus up in Canada, in Alberta and Ontario. Each outbreak had been linked to a specific restaurant, and all were genetically identical. This meant that there was a good chance all of these Shigella outbreaks were caused by the same source of contamination. The sheer breadth of locations baffled Dr. Niemi. He stared at the map. How did the same contaminant spread across both coasts, down to the Gulf of Mexico, and all the way up into Canada? He emailed his coworkers the results and asked them to help him contact every restaurant associated with an outbreak and compile a comprehensive list of foods and ingredients on their menus. There had to be something in common to all of them that was carrying this particular strain of Shigella. The next morning, one of Dr. Niemi's fellow investigators strolled into his office and handed him a Post-it note with one word written on it. Dr. Niemi read the note and couldn't help but laugh. The investigators had identified the probable source of the Shigella outbreak, and it was something that no one suspected. Dr. Naomi's department even had a term for this particular ingredient. They called it stealth food because it's used in a wide variety of dishes, yet usually goes unnoticed. Dr. Naomi congratulated his team. This was the best lead they had. He picked up a phone and he called a colleague at the Food and Drug Administration named Jeremy Brown. Dr. Naomi told Jeremy what they had discovered and said he'd need the FDA's help tracing this particular ingredient, the stealth food, to the original supplier. Global supply chains for restaurants are incredibly complex, with foods shipping from across the world and constantly being reprocessed and repackaged, and so finding one bad batch of food among all of that would not be easy. Jeremy said he would get to work. A few days later, Jeremy rode in a Jeep through Ensenada, Mexico. At first, the countryside was dry and dusty, but as they curved over a hillside, suddenly everything turned green. For miles into the distance, Jeremy saw nothing but crops in organized rows. Finally, they turned onto a dirt road and passed a sign that said the name of the farm, Valle Verde. The farmhand pointed out different fields of produce, including tomatoes, celery, cilantro, green onions, radishes, and lettuces, all watered by massive irrigation machines. But the biggest spread of all was an entire 55-acre parcel devoted to growing nothing but the stealth food Jeremy had come to investigate. And the stealth food was parsley. At some point between when it was harvested and when it was shipped, this parsley was becoming contaminated with Shigella bacteria. Jeremy was not going to leave the farm until he found out where and how this was happening. The Jeep came to a stop on the banks of an old riverbed. Since tainted water is the most common cause of Shigella, Jeremy had requested to visit the farm's water supply first. The farmhand hopped out and led them to a series of wells that provided all of the farm's water. Jeremy looked inside one of them. The stone casing was old, but uncracked. The shaft was dug very deep so that the water came from far underground, which meant the likelihood of contamination was actually quite small. Jeremy could tell the issue was not the wells. Next, the farmhand drove them past several meadows to a reservoir that served as the farm's backup water supply. It looked like a small fresh lake. The water seemed clean, but Jeremy still bottled up a couple of samples for testing back in the US. The farmhand asked Jeremy where he wanted to head next. Jeremy said he could use a break from the heat. It had gotten much hotter as the afternoon wore on. A few minutes later, the Jeep rumbled to a stop in front of a huge farm shed with a corrugated steel roof. It contained long conveyor belts stacked with crates of parsley. At the end of the line, men took those crates and stacked them on a pallet and then hosed them down with chilled water from a machine called a hydro cooler. Jeremy watched as hundreds of boxes quickly piled up and were loaded into the backs of huge trucks and then driven away to be shipped all across North America. Jeremy asked the farmhand if the water for the hydro cooler came from their wells or the reservoir, but the farmhand shook his head and said neither. The water for the hydro cooler came from Ensenada's municipal water supply. Jeremy put on his sunglasses and told the farmhand that that was where he needed to go next. At the municipal water plant, the facilities director admitted that they had been a bit overwhelmed lately. Due to government funding cutbacks, they had been understaffed for a while. With fewer security guards to watch the place, there had been a few break-ins lately, and some equipment had even been damaged. At one of the water filtration systems, Jeremy noticed that the machine that normally disinfects the water with chlorine was shut down. Jeremy asked the manager if the chlorinator had just been turned off today or if it really was not working at all. The manager shook his head in frustration and said this had been on their list to get fixed for over a month, but the city hadn't managed to send over the parts yet. Jeremy did his best to hide his shock. Without chlorine, all sorts of contaminants could flourish in the water, including Shigella. From there, the water was pumped to businesses, homes, and farms all over the area, like the parsley crop at Valle Verde. Jeremy filled several bottles to be tested and told the farmhand it was time to go. Days later, Jeremy got his results. Ensenada's municipal water was loaded with Shigella. And it was the same strain as the one found at Roberta's, Marty's, and all the other restaurants. The contaminated water had been sprayed directly onto the parsley right before being shipped to restaurants all across North America, where people like Toby, Peyton, and their families ate the parsley without giving it a second thought. Jeremy knew they had been lucky in tracking down the source relatively quickly. He estimated that as many as 1,000 diners had caught Shigella from one harvest of contaminated parsley, but it could have been so much worse. Fortunately, there were no fatalities, and both Toby and Peyton eventually made full recoveries. But very few of those who got sick will ever look at their parsley garnish the same way again. In 1991, Charles Holden was on his way home from work when he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant near his house in Harrington, Delaware. After grabbing a quick bite to eat, Charles left the store and got back in his truck. He turned it on and he was about to drive out of the lot when he stopped because there was this man running towards him, waving, trying to flag him down. So Charles put his truck back in park and he rolled his window down to see what this guy wanted. And when this stranger got close enough, he told Charles that his sister was having a baby and he needed a ride to the hospital, which was about 20 minutes away. Charles couldn't tell if this guy was lying. It was super late. He didn't know this guy, and he just had a bad feeling about him. And so he told him, "No, I'm sorry. It's too late. I gotta get home. It's too far out of the way." The stranger immediately looked dejected and turned around and started walking away. And as Charles was watching him go, he felt bad and said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride part of the way there." And so the stranger smiled, hopped in his passenger seat, and they took off. Charles drove him approximately 3 miles in the direction he had asked to go before pulling over on the side of the road and telling him, "This is as far as I'm going to take you." Charles lived only about a block away, and he didn't want to drive too far away from home so late at night. But the stranger, upon hearing he was being let out so soon, suddenly became angry and began fumbling in his pocket like he was going to get a knife or some sort of weapon, and he starts screaming at Charles, "Hand over your keys, hand over your wallet, or I'm going to kill you." Charles, meanwhile, was on edge, just being in the car with this guy because he had a bad feeling about him, and so he immediately jumped into action. He turned off his truck, he ripped the keys out of the ignition, and he leapt out of his truck and started running. Charles saw way off in the distance was a convenience store, and he figured he could run to there and get some help. But as he's running, he turns around and sees the stranger has also leapt out of the car and was now sprinting up to him with a screwdriver in his hand. And this stranger was running really fast. He was gaining on Charles, and soon Charles realized he wasn't going to make it to the convenience store before this guy caught up to him. And so at some point, Charles just stops, he turns around and puts his hands up and he says, okay, I'll give you a ride wherever you want to go, and then you can have my keys, my wallet, you can have anything you want. And so the stranger runs right up to Charles and he stops and he smiles because he's very pleased with this result. And he pokes him with the screwdriver and kind of gestures for him to go back to the truck. So Charles walks back to the truck with the stranger right behind him with the screwdriver periodically poking him in the back. They finally get to the vehicle and the stranger tells Charles to get in the car and then wait. But as soon as Charles sat down, he fired up his truck and sped off before the stranger could hop in the passenger side door. And so Charles is flying away from this guy. He looks in his rear view mirror and he can see the guy is chasing after him with a screwdriver held over his head, but he sees the stranger at some point just stops, turns around and walks away. Charles was totally relieved that he had escaped this horrible encounter, and he was thinking about calling the police, but ultimately decided he wouldn't because it was his decision to allow some stranger to get in his car in the middle of the night. And so Charles kind of blamed himself for the whole ordeal. What Charles was concerned about, though, was where he had ditched the stranger was not far from his house, and he was worried if he just turned around and drove right back to his house that this guy could recognize the truck and then follow him to his house, and then who knows what could happen. And so Charles decides he's just going to stay outside of town and drive around for a while to make sure this stranger is long gone by the time he comes back. So after about an hour of doing just that, driving around outside of town, Charles goes back into Harrington, Delaware, and he gets on his street, and he's shocked when he sees the stranger who had just tried to kill him is walking down the road right in front of him. But luckily, the stranger did not hear or see Charles pull onto his street, and so Charles immediately throws it in reverse and he gets out of there and he drives off. At this point, Charles decides he needs to tell police because he doesn't know if this stranger actually knows him and that maybe he's targeting him and he's waiting for him at his property. And so he calls 911 and he tells the dispatcher about what had happened earlier and how this guy is now lurking around his property. And the dispatcher tells him they'll send an officer out to him. And so a few minutes later, an officer showed up at the payphone where Charles was, and they told Charles they would escort him back to his property, and if the stranger was still out in the area, they would arrest him. And so the two of them made their way back to Charles's property. They get there, the stranger's long gone, and then Charles goes into his house. There's no sign of a break-in. There's no sign that anyone was near his property. And so Charles thanks the officer. He feels totally relieved. But before the officer leaves, he asks him if he wouldn't mind doing a quick sweep of his mother's property. She lived right behind Charles on the other side of some bushes. He told the officer her name was Dorothy. She was 70 years old and she lived alone. And he just wanted to make sure nothing happened to her. So the officer said, no problem, I'll go check in on her. So the officer leaves Charles and goes across his backyard through those bushes into Dorothy's backyard. And right away, he can see the back window on the back door has been smashed and the door itself is slightly ajar. And so the officer draws their pistol and they go up and they enter the house and they look inside. They're yelling for Dorothy, but there's no answer. It's totally dark in the house. It's totally silent. And so after searching the first floor and finding nothing, they make their way up the flight of stairs and they find blood at the top of the landing. And they follow this trail of blood and it brings them into one of the bedrooms where a woman is sprawled out on a bed. It was Dorothy. She had been stabbed to death. It would turn out, after Charles had ditched the stranger and sped off without him, the stranger, whose name was Gilbert Cannon, began looking for a place to sleep. And the house he ultimately selected just happened to be Charles's mother's house. After Gilbert broke in through her back door, he saw Dorothy coming down the steps to confront him, and because he was worried she'd be able to identify him, he attacked her with a screwdriver. Gilbert would later tell police that the attack on Charles was completely random. He was just at this fast food restaurant, he saw Charles get into his truck, and he thought to himself, if I can get in that guy's truck, I bet I can rob him. And then after this failed robbery, when Gilbert is out looking for a place to sleep and he breaks into this house and this woman comes down the stairs that he attacks and kills, he has no idea that this woman, Dorothy, is Charles's mother. The entire night was one big, horrible coincidence. Gilbert would plead guilty to the murder and would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 1949, 15-year-old problem child Ken Rex McElroy dropped out of school and moved to a tiny farming town called Skidmore, Missouri. There, he began his life of crime, which consisted primarily of theft. At night, he would drive his truck onto Skidmore residents' property, and he would steal their livestock, alcohol, grain, food, antiques, anything he could get his hands on and that he could sell, he would take. And if the owners ever caught him in the act, he would just raise his rifle at them and tell them to go back inside and never report it to the police or he would kill them. And because Rex was this big 270-pound monster of a man who was known for having a bad temper and for being really aggressive, people generally just did what he asked and his crimes went totally unreported. In the rare instances that victims would report Rex's crimes to police, Rex would begin intimidating them and their family by staking out their houses at all hours of the night, or he would just walk directly up to these victims and he would say, "I will kill you if you testify against me." And if none of those tactics worked, Rex used some of his illegal money to hire one of the very best defense lawyers in the entire state, a lawyer who had famously represented the mob, and he would step in and get Rex off of virtually any charge, including the time Rex actually did shoot one of the owners who caught him in the act. Over the years, Rex would use these fear and intimidation tactics not just to make money, but also to prey on young women and girls. In the 1970s, when Rex was in his 40s, he began stalking a local Skidmore girl who was 12 years old named Trina. After assaulting her dozens of times, Rex learned her family was going to be pressing charges against him. So Rex burned down Trina's family's house and killed the family dog, and then threatened to kill the entire family unless they signed paperwork that would legally marry their daughter Trina to Rex. This would protect him legally in case they pressed any charges against him. After the family finally relented and signed off on the marriage, Trina was forced to come live with Rex at his house, and within 2 years, she became pregnant. After the birth of her child, she took her baby and tried to run away from Rex, and she ran back to her family's new house, and she was hiding there, but Rex tracked her down. He took her and their baby back, and then Rex proceeded to burn her family's house down again, and again killed their new family dog. By the end of the 1970s,
the parents sat at the kitchen table, Tiffany weeping uncontrollably and going over what happened at the hospital. After the doctor had spoken to them, a woman in a brown polyester suit had led Tiffany into a dingy conference room and spent the next 45 minutes grilling her on her mothering habits and her temperament. Then she had told Tiffany that the state social workers were not going to let her and Dave take their baby home. Tiffany begged them not to take her child, but nothing she said made a difference. The social workers had already decided that it was in the best interest for the baby for her to be put in foster care. They wouldn't consider leaving Alyssa with Tiffany's mom either, since Jackie often babysat for Alyssa and therefore was a potential suspect as well if this was abuse. Tiffany was a wreck and felt like her heart had been pulled out of her chest. Meanwhile, her husband, Dave, was just furious. He kept pounding his fist on the granite countertop as Tiffany sobbed right next to him. The parents had told the doctor again and again that nobody in their family would ever hurt Alyssa. But the doctor said that Alyssa had what are called corner fractures, which would have been from violently yanking or twisting Alyssa's limbs, which is consistent with abuse. During her interview, Tiffany had tried hard to think of some explanation for Alyssa's injuries. She'd mentioned that maybe every once in a while Dave would hold Alyssa upside down, kind of as a joke, but she assured the social worker that Alyssa was giggling and laughing the whole time, and Dave only did it for like a second or two. There was no way that could have caused all these fractures in her legs. As Tiffany went over and over all the horrible things that had gone on that day, she just got up from the kitchen table and began pacing. Now she was worried that she might have accidentally said too much about the way they parented Alyssa, and that maybe she had unintentionally given more ammunition to the social workers to potentially charge them with child abuse. Tiffany and Dave would spend the rest of the night combing the internet for some explanation for Alyssa's injuries. Finally, after hours of researching, they found a condition called brittle bone disease, a rare genetic condition that causes bones to weaken and snap easily. Although Tiffany shuddered at the thought that their baby could have such an agonizing condition, she did hope that they had found something other than abuse that could explain their baby's injuries. At this point, all Tiffany and Dave cared about was just getting their daughter back. In terms of how to protect her and keep her safe from more fractures, that was something they could figure out down the road. But for now, they just wanted their kid back. 2 days later, on June 19th, Tiffany and Dave stood at a defendant's table at the Adams County Courthouse for a hearing on the next steps in their baby's case. Across the small courtroom were the two social workers who'd interviewed Tiffany and Dave at the hospital 2 days earlier. Tiffany's blood boiled when she looked over at them. She knew they were just doing their jobs, but she couldn't help feeling totally furious inside. She tried to stay calm, but she worried whether Dave could do the same. At home, he was an emotional wreck, full of rage and heartbreak at the same time. He'd barely been able to get dressed just to come to this hearing. When the hearing finally began, Tiffany's hands shook as she pulled her internet research out of her purse. She handed the printouts to the bailiff, who then walked them over to the judge. While the judge scanned the research, Tiffany began to explain how much she and Dave loved their daughter, and she begged the judge to please make the hospital test their baby for brittle bone disease. Then Tiffany did her best to remain calm, while the social workers argued that because of how the breaks in Alyssa's leg looked, there was almost no chance she had brittle bone disease. Instead, they felt that Alyssa's injuries were absolutely from non-accidental trauma. In other words, they were saying Tiffany and Dave had purposefully harmed their daughter. This suggestion made Tiffany feel sick, and the social workers' attitudes enraged her. It would be so easy to test Alyssa for brittle bone disease or any other possible medical reasons for all these leg fractures, but it just seemed like they were outright refusing, and they weren't even doctors. It felt outrageous for them to dismiss her concerns so out of hand. It seemed to Tiffany that the social workers were far more concerned with being proven right than they were about just reuniting a baby with her family. Tiffany was fighting back tears until she heard the judge say that other causes should be explored. Relief washed over Tiffany as the judge ordered emergency medical testing for their baby. Tiffany was so relieved that she felt lightheaded. For the first time in 2 days, it felt like she could finally breathe again. But the judge did say that Alyssa would have to remain in foster care until that new testing was done. Tiffany nodded and took Dave's hand, doing her best to maintain her composure. The last thing she needed right now was to come off as unstable. At least now she had a glimmer of hope that soon they would know what actually happened to Alyssa, and hopefully she'd be allowed to come back home where she belonged. The next morning, Tiffany was in her kitchen pouring water into the coffee maker for her and Dave. Dave was so depressed that he'd called in sick for work and had not gotten out of bed. Tiffany was up, but yawning from exhaustion after another sleepless night. Then the phone rang, and any hope that their life was about to return to normal flew out the window. It was a nurse from the hospital who was calling, and she told Tiffany that the social workers had scheduled Alyssa's emergency medical testing. However, they had scheduled it for early October, more than 3 months away. Tiffany could not believe it. Tiffany knew the social workers were trying to put off the tests as long as possible because they were already convinced that she and Dave were the ones abusing Alyssa. Tiffany knew the tests they were going to do would very likely prove that she and Dave really were innocent, but now they had to wait 3 months to do those tests? These were 3 months they could never get back with their daughter who was so young they needed to be with her. A week later, on the evening of June 26th, Dave couldn't stop his hands from shaking as he left work. He was on his way to visit Tiffany's grandfather, Charles Cooper. The two had become close friends over the years. Charles was a great listener, and the two men could discuss just about anything as they played pool and drank beer in Charles's basement. Dave was in a dark mood as he knocked on Charles's door. Then, after Charles opened it up and welcomed Dave inside, Dave followed the older man downstairs. Charles then handed Dave a beer and asked how he and Tiffany were holding up, and Dave immediately started talking a mile a minute. He said things were getting worse and worse and worse. He told Charles that he'd heard through the grapevine at the police station that Alyssa's social workers believed that he, Dave, was the one who'd broken Alyssa's legs. And if that was true, he would be charged with child abuse, which was a felony. Which meant there was a very real chance that in a matter of days, Dave was going to be arrested. And the reality of this was so overwhelming, Dave felt like he was losing his mind. Charles just shook his head in disbelief and asked what had made Dave the lead suspect. But Dave just shrugged. All day, he had been replaying in his mind the interview he had done at the hospital with the social worker, and the only thing he could think of that made him look kind of guilty was the fact that both he and Tiffany had mentioned that Dave periodically held his daughter upside down just to make her laugh. David stressed that he did this totally gently, but clearly the social workers did not believe him, and they thought that whatever Dave was doing when he flipped his daughter upside down was hurting her. Charles walked over and gave Dave a hug and told him to just keep the faith. But Dave shook his head. In a little more than a week, he'd gone from being the proud father of a happy family to an alleged child abuser facing a steep prison sentence. Dave took a sip of his beer and told Charles that he was terrified of going to prison. He'd heard horror stories of what happened to cops who wound up behind bars, and he was also scared that Tiffany would leave him if he was incarcerated. Charles tried to offer some comfort, but Dave was just too upset and scared to be reasoned with. Dave knew enough about the criminal justice system to understand that he would need money for a good lawyer, plus about $50,000 for bail, and if he did really go to trial and was found guilty, he'd lose his job, he'd lose his house, he'd lose his family. He just knew this whole ordeal was going to totally destroy him. Dave apologized to Charles and said he just needed to go. He wanted to be home with his wife, or maybe walk the neighborhood and clear his head. And without another word, Dave hopped up, he jogged up the basement stairs, and left out the front door of the house. 2 days later, Tiffany was at her parents' house for breakfast. She tried to eat, but mostly she just moved the food around her plate. She told her parents that she was really worried about her husband. Over the past couple of days, he'd been growing more and more despondent, and he didn't want to talk. He was convinced that his life was about to be over. Tiffany was trying to be strong and hold their family together, but it was proving to be a nearly impossible task, because as much as she wanted to reassure Dave, she was growing increasingly worried too. She told her parents that she had to be realistic. Even if she was not charged with abuse, Dave's legal fees could cost them their house. And if he went to prison, she couldn't afford to live on her own. She'd be a single mother raising Alyssa in her parents' basement. Tiffany turned to her father, Paul, and begged him to please help her save her family. She didn't know what they could do exactly. Her parents didn't have a ton of money, and nobody could convince the social workers to remove Alyssa from foster care. But Tiffany was desperate. All she wanted was to hear her parents say everything is going to be okay. Paul laid his hand on Tiffany's forearm and promised her he would do everything he could. But realistically, the gesture just didn't make Tiffany feel any better. She felt like if she wanted to save her family, she'd have to do it herself. A few hours later, Tiffany sat inside of a small beige office in Denver with a dark wood desk and matching bookshelves. The shelves were cluttered with legal books, an old encyclopedia set, and all sorts of awards and honors. Behind the desk, an older attorney with a balding head sat leafing through Alyssa's case file. After talking with her parents that morning, Tiffany had realized she really needed to start looking out for herself and Alyssa in case Dave did go to jail. So she'd made this appointment in the hopes that this lawyer could help her get her child back. The lawyer kept periodically rapping his knuckles on his desk like he was totally lost in thought trying to think something through, to the point where Tiffany wondered if he'd actually forgotten she was in his office too. But then the lawyer coughed and kind of leaned back in his leather chair and looked at Tiffany. Finally, he spoke. He told Tiffany he had an idea. She should file for divorce. Tiffany felt like she'd been punched. She just stared at the lawyer, saying nothing, expecting him to admit that somehow this had been a joke. But then the lawyer explained that no, in his professional opinion, Dave did not stand a chance and was going to be imprisoned. And so if she wanted any shot of getting custody of their baby once Dave was incarcerated, this was a necessary first step. Tiffany felt totally outraged. She wanted a lawyer who would help keep her family together, not try to break it up. She told the lawyer she did not need to think about this. There was no way she was going to do this. But the entire ride home, her mind just continued to race. She knew that Dave had never touched their baby, and certainly the court would have to see that too. She couldn't just abandon her husband. How would she even talk to him about a divorce? And yet, when it came to thinking about Alyssa, Tiffany was just not willing to leave anything to chance. Tiffany knew she had a big decision to make here. She just hoped that when the time came, she'd make the right one. 2 days later, Alyssa's foster mom rushed into the ER at the Denver Children's Hospital and asked to speak with the doctor, who initially saw Alyssa for bone fractures. Alyssa was in the foster mother's arms, and both her legs were still in splints, and she was crying as though she was in pain. The foster mom tried to rock Alyssa back and forth and shush her, but nothing seemed to be working. In fact, the foster mother would tell the medical team that Alyssa had been crying all morning no matter what she tried to do to calm her down. Finally, the doctor walked into the waiting room and he called the foster mother and Alyssa into an exam room. The doctor gingerly took Alyssa out of the foster mother's arms and asked what seemed to be the matter here. As Alyssa continued to cry, the foster mom stroked Alyssa's forehead and explained that she was really concerned about Alyssa's lack of development. Ever since she came to the foster house 2 weeks ago, she hadn't been moving her limbs very much. Plus, her legs still seemed extremely sensitive to the touch, like they were not healing at all. She'd also developed a rapid breathing pattern that sounded raspy and forced. The doctor nodded and told the foster mother that she had done the right thing in bringing the baby back to the hospital. The doctor laid Alyssa on a tiny examination table and then began gently moving the baby's arms and legs. And as he did this, and as Alyssa continued to cry, the doctor would tell the foster mother that it did seem like Alyssa did not have the reflexes she should be developing by 3 months of age. The foster mother watched as the doctor tried to get Alyssa to grasp his pen, but the baby could not hold it. The doctor turned back to the foster mom and told her that he wanted to run a few genetic tests. And in fact, these were the exact tests that Alyssa was supposed to receive by court order, but not for another 3 months. The doctor also mentioned to the foster mother that he was supposed to meet with Tiffany and Dave earlier that morning, but they had not shown up. And so he told the foster mother that he would be sure to update Tiffany and Dave on this new plan to run these new tests sooner, as soon as they talked again. While the doctor continued to examine Alyssa, her foster mom stepped into the hallway. She called the social workers on Alyssa's case to let them know that Alyssa was back at the ER and that the doctor did seem to think that something else could be going on here with the baby. The social worker thanked her and then promised they would update Alyssa's parents. The foster mom hung up and then went back into the room to wait. But about 30 minutes later, one of the social workers called back to say that they'd tried to contact Tiffany and Dave, but both their phones went right to voicemail. The foster mom nodded and said that she just hoped everything was okay. Around 3 p.m. that same afternoon, June 30th, Tiffany's mother, Jackie, was also trying to get a hold of Tiffany and Dave. She'd been calling them all morning, but neither had picked up. Their radio silence really worried Jackie. She knew the parents had several important meetings that day that they could not afford to miss. At 8 a.m., they had an appointment at the hospital about their child abuse case. Jackie had expected some kind of update afterwards, but had not heard a thing. Then at 11 a.m., Dave was supposed to meet with his lawyer, who was going to take him to the police station to be questioned by the detective on Alyssa's case. Then at 1 p.m., Tiffany had an appointment with her own lawyer. Tiffany had not updated Jackie about what she was going to do yet with regards to filing for divorce or not, and as much as it pained Jackie to admit this, she did think that Tiffany would have to divorce Dave in order to get her baby back. Tiffany had promised to stay in touch with her mom, Jackie, all throughout the day, but now it was going on 3 p.m. and Jackie hadn't heard a peep. Jackie called Tiffany and Dave's house and their cell phones again, but still nothing. Jackie went upstairs to her bedroom where her husband, Paul, was napping, and she tapped him on the shoulder. Paul woke up and asked if she'd heard from Tiffany, but Jackie just shook her head and said she didn't know where they were and couldn't get in touch with them. And then she suggested that, maybe Paul should drive over to their house and see if they were okay. Paul didn't hesitate. He jumped out of bed, grabbed the keys, and then he and Jackie headed out the door towards the car. A few minutes later, Jackie and Paul pulled up outside of their daughter's house, and immediately, Jackie got a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. Tiffany and Dave's cars were in the driveway, which meant they had to be home, and yet their dog was sitting on the front porch, as though she'd been waiting to be let in for hours. Jackie and Paul made their way to the front door and rang the bell, but nobody answered. Jackie's chest tightened as she pounded on the door and called to Tiffany and Dave, but nobody called back. Paul had brought along a spare set of keys, so he pulled them out of his pocket and he unlocked the front door. And the second they stepped inside of that house, Jackie sensed something was wrong. It was just too quiet. Paul went ahead of her and headed down the hallway to the bedroom. Jackie hung back in the foyer and just decided to call 911. And just seconds later, Jackie heard Paul let out a blood-curdling scream. Paul had just discovered his own daughter and her husband dead inside of their bedroom. There was no note, but it was obvious what had happened. Dave had shot and killed Tiffany, and then he had taken his own life. A week later, Alyssa's test results came back, and one thing was absolutely clear. She had never been abused by her parents. She was diagnosed not with brittle bone disease, like Tiffany and Dave had thought, but instead with something even more rare. The baby had spinal muscular atrophy, a debilitating genetic disease that causes muscles to steadily shrink and weaken. Tragically, there's no treatment for spinal muscular atrophy, and in newborns, the disease is always fatal. Doctors concluded that Alyssa's bone fractures either came during her birth or just from normal handling after birth. In short, Dave and Tiffany had done nothing wrong. But the situation had spiraled so out of control that Dave felt like there was just no more hope, that he'd never get his daughter back, that he'd have to go to jail, and that everybody would think he and his wife were child abusers when they really were not. And so this is very likely why he chose to end his life and his wife's life. It's just this horribly tragic thing that was totally avoidable. After Alyssa's diagnosis, the court would grant custody of Alyssa to Tiffany's parents, Jackie and Paul. But they never received an apology or any acknowledgement that Alyssa should have never been taken away from her parents. But for Jackie and Paul, their focus was on the baby, and over the next few months, they did their best to care for Alyssa. However, as the doctors had predicted, Alyssa grew progressively weaker and her body continued to break down, and by the time Alyssa was just 7 months old, the stress and pain were too much for her little body, and she would die in her grandparents' arms. And 31-year-old Larry Bader was living with his wife, Mary Lou, and their 3 kids in Akron, Ohio. Larry was a good father and good husband, but he was a terrible businessman. Over the past several years, he had launched several new business ventures, and they had all failed, throwing the family into fairly significant debt. And so even though Larry desperately wanted to be an entrepreneur and eventually start a quality business, they didn't have the money to do that. And so he had to just take some job in order to pay the bills. And so the job he got was a cookware salesman for a local company, and it did pay the bills, but it did not make Larry happy. And so on the weekends when Larry was not working, and if it was okay with his wife, he would basically just disappear and go fishing on Lake Erie, which is about an hour north of where they lived. And that was his way of kind of disconnecting from reality and kind of disconnecting from his somewhat crappy life. And so on Friday, March 15th, Larry approached his wife and said, "Hey, I'd like to head up to Lake Erie and go fishing for the weekend." And she would tell him, "I got the kids, it's fine, you can go do that, but I heard the weather was going to be really bad. Are you sure that's such a good idea?" And Larry would tell her, "You know what, don't worry about it. These storms, they always hype them up. They're never a big deal. I'll be fine." And so he kissed his wife, he kissed his kids, he grabbed his stuff, he hopped in his truck, and he left and headed up to Lake Erie. That night, Lake Erie was hit with a massive thunderstorm, way bigger than the one that the news was predicting. And then the following morning, the Coast Guard discovered Larry's boat floating around on Lake Erie. There was minor damage to it, and it was missing an oar, and it was missing Larry. Larry was nowhere to be found. And so a search was launched for Larry, but he was never found, and he was eventually declared dead. And so even though the family did not have Larry's body, they would hold a funeral for him, and his wife was able to actually cash his life insurance policy, which was enough to pay for her and the kids. 8 years later, in 1965, Larry Bader's niece, a 21-year-old woman named Suzanne Peka, was in Chicago at a sporting goods show with a friend of hers. And as they're walking through the different exhibits, looking at different sporting goods equipment, they noticed over on the side of the building, there was a fairly large group of people gathered around this one particular exhibit. And so she and her friend she was with walked over to this group, and they kind of pushed their way through. And in the middle of this group was this man with an eye patch and a big mustache doing an archery demonstration. Basically, he was shooting arrows into a target about 30 feet away. And so Suzanne and her friend just kind of watched this guy for a couple of minutes, and very quickly they could see why he was attracting this big crowd, because he was just an incredible archer. He was hitting the bullseye over and over and over again. But as they continued to watch this guy, Suzanne's friend started to notice something unique about him. And he eventually turned to Suzanne and said, "Hey, doesn't this guy look exactly like your uncle who went missing on Lake Erie?" And Suzanne was kind of surprised to hear him talking about her missing uncle, but she turned and looked at this guy, and all of a sudden she saw it too. He was a spitting image of Larry Bader, her uncle, although this guy had an eye patch and a mustache, but even with that, he looked exactly like Larry. And as Suzanne is watching him, she's thinking, Larry was known for being this incredible archer, and here this guy is who looks just like him, and he's an incredible archer. And so after this demonstration was over, Suzanne and the friend ran over to this guy with the eye patch on, and Suzanne says to him, "Hey, I know this sounds totally crazy, but you look exactly like my uncle, Larry Bader, who went missing on Lake Erie 8 years ago." And so the guy, he hears her and he kind of smiles and says, "I'm sorry, I don't know Larry Bader. My name is John Johnson. People call me Fritz. I'm sorry, I don't know who your uncle is. I can't help you." But Suzanne, as she stood there staring at this guy, she was becoming more and more convinced this was Larry Bader, despite the fact this guy is saying he is not Larry Bader. And so she says to him, "No, you are Larry Bader. I'm positive you're my uncle. Now at this, Fritz would be polite but firm, and he would reiterate that, look, I'm not your uncle. I don't know who Larry Bader is. I don't go to Lake Erie. I just don't understand why you think I'm him. I live in Omaha, Nebraska with my wife and my kids, and I'm on TV. I do sports journalism in Omaha, and I advise archery companies, and that's why I'm here. So I don't know why you think I'm your uncle, but I'm not. I'm sorry. And with that, Fritz turned around and he walked away. And after this discussion, Suzanne and her friend were not remotely deterred from what Fritz was saying. They were completely convinced this was Larry Bader. And so they ran to a phone, and Suzanne called her two other uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, and she explained how she met this guy that is the spitting image of their brother. And they immediately hopped on a flight that night and flew to Chicago. And the following morning, the two uncles, along with Suzanne and her friend, they went back to the sporting goods show. They went over to the archery exhibit, and sure enough, there was Fritz doing his archery demonstration. And as soon as there was a break, Suzanne, her friend, and now the two uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, they walk over, and the two uncles, as soon as they see this guy, despite the eye patch, despite the mustache, they too would say, this is our brother. And so they approached him and they said, look, I know you're saying you are not our brother. I don't know what's going on here, but you look exactly like our brother. And we have his military paperwork right here with fingerprints. Will you please just humor us and go to the police station with us and get fingerprinted? That way you can prove you really are not our brother. Please, we've been looking for our brother for a long time. This would be a huge favor to us. And so Fritz was annoyed. He didn't want to do it, but he's like, okay, fine. I'll go to the police station with you. I'll get my fingerprints taken and we can put this behind us. And so that day they left the sporting goods show. They went to a police station and Fritz had his fingerprints taken. And afterwards, the police would tell him, you are Larry Bader. When Fritz heard this, he could not believe it. I mean, he literally did not believe he was Larry Bader. It wasn't like this revelation prompted new memories and suddenly he recalled it all. It was really the opposite. Fritz immediately is trying to rack his brain to figure out, like, is my whole life a lie? But there was nothing. All he had was a contiguous stretch of memories from when he was a very young child as Fritz Johnson all the way to the present. But we now know that the bulk of his memories are all not real. He was never a child as Fritz Johnson. He was Larry Bader and then became Fritz Johnson only 8 years earlier. The timeline of what happened to Larry Bader is rough at best, but as far as we understand it, Fritz Johnson showed up in Omaha, Nebraska a couple of days or a couple of months after Larry Bader went missing on Lake Erie. And when Fritz showed up in Omaha, he just walked into a restaurant and asked for a job there, and he had provided documentation that showed he was in fact Fritz Johnson, and nobody thought anything of it. He was completely normal. There was nothing unusual about his behavior, and over time, Fritz just kind of thread himself into the Omaha community. I mean, he got married, he had a child, he adopted another child, he left his job as a bartender at a restaurant and eventually got this amazing job as a sports TV broadcaster for their local channel. I mean, he was like a minor celebrity in Omaha. Everybody recognized, oh, there's Fritz Johnson. He's on TV. Hey, Fritz, how you doing? I mean, he had a full-blown life. But as soon as the news broke that he was not Fritz Johnson, he was Larry Bader, right away, the TV station he worked for fired him. His second wife left him because in reality, he actually was still legally married to his first wife. And so his marriage to his second wife was never actually real to begin with. And so she leaves him. And then also because Larry Bader was no longer dead, the insurance company that had paid out all that money to his first wife as part of his life insurance policy, they demanded that he repay them. And throughout all this drama of Fritz finding out he's Larry Bader, Fritz continued to say he was not Larry Bader, that this was all a big mistake. He just could not understand how this could have happened. None of it made sense. And so eventually a team of experts, doctors, psychologists, you name it. They came out to Omaha and they ran Fritz, aka Larry Bader, through a battery of tests over almost 2 weeks. And at the end of all their testing, they concluded that 1, Fritz definitely is Larry Bader. So there's no debate there. He is Larry Bader. And 2, he is almost certainly suffering from an extreme case of amnesia, which is memory loss. But the doctors and experts had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And of course, Fritz, he too had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And it's unlikely we'll ever get any more clarity on exactly what happened to Larry Bader / Fritz, because unfortunately, just 1 year after it was discovered Fritz was Larry Bader, Fritz would die. He had cancer in one of his eyes, and that was actually why he wore that eye patch, and the cancer had come back and it took his life. Today, his case is considered to be one of the most believable and baffling cases of amnesia on record. Before we get into our next story, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, HelloFresh. Back during the beginning of the pandemic, we were not able to get groceries or have food delivered to our house. And so before long, we were down to eating just the Diet Cheetos and pickled licorice. And as I was eating my 77th bag of Diet Cheetos, I thought to myself, is there anything better for me to eat? And that's when I discovered HelloFresh. HelloFresh is like one of those things where as soon as you have it, you think to yourself, how could I have ever lived without this? They send you this neat little box full of meals, and there's all these incredible meals to choose from fairly intricate to very quick and easy. And so whatever your tastes are, they got it. But the catch is they are not made. You are the chef and you make the meals. And before you tell me that you're a bad chef, I'm a bad chef, and I'm able to whip these meals together no problem because all the ingredients are perfectly proportioned, which also means you don't waste any food, and the recipes are incredibly easy to follow. So the end product is home-cooked, fresh, delicious food every time. So if your New Year's resolution is to eat better or to just stop snarfing as many Diet Cheetos, then you really need to sign up for HelloFresh. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com, use the code MrBallen16 to get up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Okay, back to the stories. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga in northern Colombia lies this thick green jungle. And if you know where to look, there is actually a walking path that leads you from Amaga deep into this jungle. And if you keep going, it will bring you all the way to this terrifying, enormous old railroad bridge that spans this huge ravine. Now, this bridge is no longer used by trains. It's been decommissioned. However, since its decommissioning, there's actually been, ironically, more traffic on this bridge, although it is the foot traffic variety. People come out to this bridge to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people will leap off of high places, like this bridge, and they'll jump with an elastic rope tied to their ankles. And so this rope has been very carefully measured so that when it is fully stretched all the way out, it ensures whoever has jumped will still not impact the ground. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez, who lived about an hour north of Amaga in the larger city of Medellin, she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. This was something Yesenia had talked about for a long time, wanting to go bungee jumping, but every time it became a real thing and they were actually going to go do it, she would back down because she was just too scared. But for whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia had the confidence and the courage to actually see this thing through. And so her boyfriend, when he heard how serious she was, he capitalized on the opportunity because he had never bungee jumped before and he really wanted to, but he couldn't without his girlfriend. And so now it seemed like she was serious. And so right away, he called the Amaga bungee jumping company to book a slot for he and Yesenia to jump off of their bridge. So on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend hopped in their car and they drove an hour south to Amaga. And when they got there, they found the walking trail and they made their way out to this bridge. And when they get out to this bridge, they are amazed at the number of people who were already in line on this bridge waiting to jump off of it. They knew this was a popular spot, but perhaps they didn't realize just how popular it was. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they get in line behind the nearly 100 other jumpers ahead of them, and they proceed to wait.
And over the next several hours, Yesenia and her boyfriend would have front row seats to all of the jumpers ahead of them jumping off the bridge. Now, it seems like Yesenia, in her mind, believed she would arrive at this bridge and very quickly she and her boyfriend would leap off and it would be great and so much fun. But now they've been forced to wait for a really long time. And this whole time, they're watching other people jump. And Yesenia is starting to panic. Suddenly, bungee jumping looked terrifying. It did not look like something she wanted to do. And so she was beginning to second guess her decision. And so her boyfriend, he's trying to calm her down and he's telling her, oh, it's totally safe. Look at all these people who have jumped. They're all fine. They're all smiling. They're so happy. You're going to be so proud of yourself. But despite his best efforts to calm his girlfriend down, Yesenia just could not calm down. But she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. She's going to go through with this. And so several hours went by of this totally high stress, anxious waiting period. And then finally, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line, at which point the staff members who've been doing this all day long, they signal the two to step forward and get their harnesses on. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they make their way to the edge of the platform. So they're looking out over this ravine and the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready. And the whole time, Yesenia, she's starting to get tunnel vision. Her heart is racing. She's totally panicked. She doesn't think this is fun at all. She just wants to get this over with. And then at some point, one of the staff members finally says, okay, jump. And so Yesenia jumps. Except it would turn out Yesenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, okay, jump, was talking to her boyfriend, not Yesenia. However, Yesenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. However, the staff members had only put her harness on. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so when Yesenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. And so as soon as she leapt off the bridge, her boyfriend ripped off all of his gear and he ran down the bridge. He leapt over the railing and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine. But when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yesenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down, which means she must have realized after she jumped that she jumped too early, that she did not have the bungee cord attached to her legs. And so literally the fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. In early 1974, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living happily with his wife Christine and their 5 children in Ossett, which is a small town in central England. Michael was described as a great father and a great husband who had an excellent sense of humor. In fact, neighbors, whenever they would walk past the Taylor household, would say you could often hear the sound of Michael laughing or the sound of him telling jokes to his family. But in April of that year, everything changed for the Taylor family. Michael had been doing some home repairs when he fell off of a ladder and he hurt his back. The injury itself was fairly minor, but it resulted in chronic pain. And this chronic pain quickly changed how Michael behaved. Michael went from being this cheerful, funny, happy guy to being sad and depressed. And he was so irritable that his family could barely be around him because he would lash out at them. Now, the Taylor family was not a religious family. However, most families who lived in Ossett at that time were. And so when one of Michael's friends found out about how poorly Michael was doing, they approached Michael and said, you know, you really ought to turn to religion for help and for guidance in this difficult time. And they also told him specifically that he really ought to check out this one particular Christian group. It was called the Christian Fellowship Group, and all it was a prayer group for Christians who wanted more religious support beyond just going to church on Sundays. But this friend of Michael's told him that the real draw of this group was the group's leader. Her name was Marie Robinson, and she was this 21-year-old, extremely friendly and energetic and charismatic person who just had this incredible way of making all of her members really feel like they belonged. And so Michael's friend was telling him that he really thought Marie could be the difference maker for him, that she could help him get back to normal. And so Michael, you know, he trusted this friend and he really didn't have much to lose at this point. He was already at rock bottom, and so he agrees to go check this group out. So on September 12th of that year, Michael makes
his way to the church where this fellowship group is held. He goes inside and he makes his way to one of the back rooms in the church. And when he goes inside, he sees there's a ring of people sitting in a circle, about 20 people. And as soon as they see Michael coming in the room, they all stand up and they open their arms up and they say, "Come on, come sit down with us. Welcome to the group." And then the woman who had to be Marie, she stands up and she looks at Michael, huge smile on her face, and she encourages him to come over and sit right next to me. "Welcome. We'd love to have you join our group." And so Michael, for the first time in ages, is smiling as he strides across the room and sits down right next to Marie. And then as Marie began to lead the group in prayer, Michael did not feel his chronic pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael went back home again, the pain and depression came flooding back. It was like the only place he could be happy was inside of the church at this fellowship group. And so over the next couple of weeks, Michael completely prioritized this group. He went to all of their meetings, and over the course of these couple of weeks, Michael became very close with Marie, and apparently Marie became very close with Michael, to the point where the two of them would stay after the meetings were over, and just those two would sequester themselves in quiet prayer. No one knew what they did in there, but it just seemed like they were developing a real relationship. And in fact, many people in this group suspected they were having an affair. And before long, the rumors in the church had spread outside and were all over Ossett. And then before long, Christine, Michael's wife, was hearing from a friend or a neighbor that apparently Michael was having an affair with Marie. Now, Christine had already suspected her husband was having an affair with Marie because Marie was the only thing Michael talked about when he got home. So on October 1st of that year, only a couple of weeks after Michael had first attended this group, Christine waited until Michael had left the house to head out to one of the group meetings, and then Christine hopped in her car and she followed him to the church. And when she got there, she parked her car, she took a deep breath, and then she got out, she made her way to the front doors of the church, and she stormed inside, and she found the room where these meetings were held. She barges in, and she points at her husband, and she says, "I know you're having an affair with Marie, and you're going to admit it in front of this whole group." And Michael, who's sitting with his back to his wife in one of the chairs, he stands up, and instead of addressing his wife, who's accused him of infidelity, he turns and looks at Marie on the other side of the room. And when Marie made eye contact with Michael, she screamed. She would later say Michael did not look human. He looked like a beast, and he had wild eyes. And so as Michael is standing there staring at Marie with this very aggressive face, he began breaking out in tongues. Speaking in tongues is where the speaker will be saying or uttering words or sounds that sound like language, but the speaker doesn't know what they mean. The idea is some entity has come inside of their body, and this entity is dictating their speech. And so Michael is broken out in tongues. He's barking these words and sounds at Marie, and everyone inside of the room has no idea what to make of this. Everything has happened so suddenly, and it's so surprising. You have the wife suddenly coming in and aggressively accusing her husband of cheating, and Michael is not responding to it, and he's acting totally crazy. And then before anyone can do anything, Michael goes from just barking in strange languages at Marie to suddenly rushing across the room as if he's going to attack her. And when he does that, the rest of the members jump on top of him and hold him down. And despite there being like 10 or 15 people holding him down, Michael is still trying to get up, and he's screaming and snarling and yelling at Marie. And then Marie suddenly breaks out into tongues too. And it's only then that Michael stops trying to force himself up out of this pig pile that's on top of him, and instead he just continues to speak in tongues to her. And so the two of them are looking at each other speaking in tongues, and the rest of the group is just totally dumbfounded, and so they just begin praying. And then after about an hour, Michael just collapses. It's like he went unconscious. And at that point, everybody in the room just goes silent, and they look at Michael, and then Michael kind of opens his eyes, and it's almost like he's waking up, and he begins looking around frantically, trying to figure out what had just happened. Michael would claim he had no memory of what had just happened to him. And so at this point, Marie would tell him and Christine that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force, and the only thing they could do at this point would be to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is an expulsion or attempted expulsion of a supposedly evil spirit inside of a person or a place. Michael and Christine were at a loss. They had no idea what to do in this situation. They were both kind of in shock for very different reasons, and so they just kind of deferred to Marie's judgment and said, yeah, I think think an exorcism is the way to go. So Christine and Michael just leave the church and go home, and then the next morning, Marie would get in touch with the Anglican Church of England and would request an exorcism. And after hearing about what was going on with Michael, the Anglican Church would say, yeah, that does sound like he needs an exorcism. And so the following day, they would send out two of their best exorcists named Peter and Raymond. And so Peter and Raymond, they get to Ossett, they go to Michael's house, and they observe him. And very quickly, they determine that it does seem like Michael is possessed by at least one demonic force. And so they tell Michael, the only thing we can do here is perform this exorcism, but we need you to agree to it. And so Michael says, okay, yeah, I agree to this exorcism. And so would his wife, because she at this point is just completely unsure what to do. She's just going along for the ride. So a day later, on October 4th at 10 p.m., Michael, his wife, and the rest of the members of this fellowship group, along with Peter and